The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everyone to our Microsoft Manager Portal webinar today. My name is Derek Krebs and I'll be presenting today's session. I'll start with a couple minutes inside PowerPoint to introduce myself and the topic, and then we'll spend the bulk of the time looking at the application and some great little tips and tricks on the application. So as this slide speaks to, my name is Derek Krebs. I am a senior consultant with the MSX Group. And a little bit of our background, including myself and most of the team members at MSX Group. We started way back when, if we turn the clock back about 25 some odd years ago, we started at the private company called FRX Software. And we had such great reporting and budgeting products that Microsoft acquired us. And we internally worked at Microsoft going on upward to 15 of those 27 years. And then approximately 12 years ago, we were then spun off as our own subsidiary entity. And when doing so, we released the product Prospero, which replaces the flagship products of Microsoft's that does Prospero, both reporting and budgeting. I'll talk about a little bit of the product releases here in just a moment. So again, welcome one and all. A couple of housekeeping notes to make is everybody's on mute. There is a question area, so if you have any questions throughout today's session, please take advantage of that, and I'll try to field some questions throughout the session or the tail end. Or if there's some questions I'll postpone, I'll follow up you individually if it's more specific or outside the scope of the material today. All right, so maybe just a couple more minutes inside PowerPoint, and then we'll jump right into the product here. All right, as far as today's agenda, I'll just spend a moment or two referring to some product releases to be aware of to make sure you're on the latest, greatest releases. Followed by, we'll talk about some further year-end concepts to be aware of, as that's the theme of today's session for year-end tips and tricks. Product demonstration, obviously, the bulk of today's time, and then definitely some Q&A along the way as needed. First of all, to be aware of the current product releases out there. Even though they might be a little dated, Microsoft used to come out with quarterly patches, especially for Manager Portal. However, approximately 4 years ago, back in 2017, is the last release they did. So that latest version of Manager Portal is called Manager Portal 2012, and there was the cumulative update number 16, or Service Pack 16, which is the latest and greatest. On the budgeting side, for Microsoft Forecaster, that latest release was version 7, Service Pack 5. That was older than that. And finally, even though you'd be surprised, the FRX product, even though it hasn't been updated since 2011, we still support hundreds of customers in that product. So please be rest assured, even though Microsoft's no longer doing mainstream support or no longer doing updates or Service Pack to that MSX group, since we're the founding members and help develop, write those products, we will continue to support that for years ahead. And I'll have a couple other remarks on that in just a moment. Now, some latest product news. Manager Portal, especially Microsoft, used to have 4 different general ledgers, like Dynamics GP for Great Plains, SL for Solomon, AX, and Navision. Well, going forward, Microsoft now has the Dynamics 365 as their platform, which is a more web-based tool. And what Microsoft basically did is they took the existing Manager Portal product and they sort of plugged and played it and forced it into the Dynamics 365 product. They took away some features, unfortunately, but it still will be at least one option that you have for financial reporting and budgeting. As far as Microsoft Forecaster on the budgeting side, that was a great tool to get away from Excel hell. So that did come included with most of the Dynamics packages, so be aware of the licenses you probably have available. And third and finally, at the very bottom, about 12 years ago, Prospero was released to the product. So I'd say most of the existing customers using Manager Portal and Forecaster have migrated to Prospero due to numerous advantages. One is those products are no longer mainstream support, no longer being developed by Microsoft. Instead of 2 separate applications and processes where you're doing double your work on the reporting and budgeting side, now it's one seamless tool and process using Prospero. So we'll probably provide some information in a follow-up email afterwards. And this session, and a common question we get is, will be recorded. And we'll be sharing that recording here in the next few days with an email follow-up along with this PowerPoint slide, a link to the recording. And additionally, and I'm going to do a sidestep, I probably get one of the most common questions is, Derek, you're showing us a couple great tips and tricks, but there's only so much I can cram inside a PowerPoint, hence the recording will be a nice little reference tool. But in addition, there is a big, beefy training and user guides of Microsoft. So I'm broadcasting now currently about 20 some odd chapters of Microsoft Manager Porter. So if you do not have these training and user guides, please do jot down my email and I'll be sure to get those in your hands. And what I'll do on that note here is even I'll go up a slide or two for my email to please take down. That is derek.krebs@msxgroup.com. So I'll try to be a nice information source for you for some other nuggets outside of today's session. Last slide or two, then we'll jump right into the application. This is really just going to be some agenda bullet point tips for today. The most common question we've gotten over the years is, hey, Derek, I have not done a year-end close. We're already in maybe January and February of the year, but my balance sheets and cash flows are not working. So we're going to show you how you can circumvent that, meaning if I have not done my year-end close, we can still have the balance sheet grab and foot in your reports. Some other key concepts we'll be leveraging are report groups and schedules. Also, where you can run reports on the fly. We'll talk about the different viewers of the web viewer and client viewer. Some house cleaning would be in what's called the report library, where all reports are stored. We'll be sure to acquaint you with that area and some maintenance and cleanup that we recommend each cycle or year to not have so much clutter out there, including also, I was just talking about the report library of outputted reports, but we'll also talk about your rows, columns, and trees to keep a nice manageable list of those. And finally, at the bottom, some other notes I'll be sharing with you today is at year end, there are some other common audit reports that you would like to do some year-end reconciliation, or you might be audited, of some nice seamless ways you can accomplish those tasks. Now, what if you can't close the year? That again being one of the, I probably got hundreds of calls over the years of such item here. The reasons might vary on such, but we want to keep your balance sheet and cash flows accurate. So I won't read off those little bullet points. Instead, let's jump now directly into the application. So the first report I want to pull up is going to be a balance sheet, and we're going to look at the two different viewers as well at a high level. Currently, I'm in what we call the client viewer, which is a program that gets installed on your computer. Or secondly, I'm going to look at that same report in the web viewer. So several web browsers are supported. So I'm looking at Microsoft Edge or Explorer now. It's basically the same report data, same drill down to the account and transaction level, etc. A few little minor differences. Now, I'm going to probably spend most of my time inside the client viewer. And a little heads up that we'll be looking throughout today's session on is here in the lower left, we have a concept, what's called the report library, where you can store your reports in different folders and even have some non-financial reports, including supporting schedules like Excel, Word, PowerPoint. You also can include inside this library. But let me just focus here on the report data itself of this balance sheet. And before I get further into the balance sheet, when I mentioned the two different viewers, like here to the left, the web viewer, that requires no installation at all. So if I had 100 managers, no installation required. However, to see a financial report, since they're all stored behind the scenes in one SQL database, yes, they have to be on the network and they have to be a user defined within Manager Porter. Now inside the designer, where you power users in the accounting, where you have the rows, columns, and trees used for report, and when you edit, create, or generate the reports, I'm now currently showing that. And let me just take you to one little link, because found under Tools, then Options, is where you can tell the system which viewer you prefer. And I, as a power user in the accounting area, I definitely recommend having this check mark turned on, because when I install Manager Porter out of the box, normally this check mark to use the Manager Porter viewer is turned off. That means If it's turned off, whenever you run a report, it will automatically open up in the web viewer. But I personally prefer the client viewer, so I suggest turning that on. And then the client viewer gives you better viewing experience and maintenance, as I'll shed more light on that here in the minutes to follow. All right, so let me look inside the client viewer. In this balance sheet, let me first of all talk about a normal balance sheet. So this column B like boy is such. Now here to the right, if you do not do a year-end close, we utilize these columns to the right. And as I describe those further, it's best if I just show you inside the report designer. I'm going to open up the column definition for that. So here's that column. My normal balance sheet is simply grabbing data from the general ledger, what they call a financial dimension column, grabbing actuals, or sometimes you might have budgets, and I'll have a couple of remarks on budgets in today's session. And finally, here at the very bottom, a balance sheet simply grabs year-to-date ending amounts. Okay, great. Whenever I do very timely closes, I can grab the year-to-date end, especially in a balance sheet, unlike income statement accounts. Balance sheets then, when you do your general ledger close, those year-end balances for balance sheet will then move forward to a beginning balance the following year, along with income statement accounts, then net to zero at the beginning of the year, and then they flow that income into retained earnings. Now, if I do not close timely, because I might be here in maybe January, February, period 1 or 2, whatever your fiscal year is, and if I do not close, then here is how I can easily accommodate my balance sheet and cash flow reports, where I simply will utilize 3 columns, respectively from the left to the right. The first column is going to grab my prior year end. Prior year, I'm just looking at the fiscal year of base minus 1 to look to the prior year. Year end, I'm looking at period 12. And finally, year end is a year-to-date column versus periodic. That means the monthly net change. Okay, and if I do not close my year timely, and I might be in period 1, 2, 3, 4 the following year, I still want to grab the activity of both my balance sheet and income statement accounts from the prior year end. So this column E here will be grabbing the current year activity for whatever base year you run it. Let's call it 2022. Now notice the period range here. If I was in period 2, that'd grab period 1 to 2 activity, meaning periodic monthly balances. Or if I ran the report for period 3, that'd grab me period 1 through 3 activity. And then finally, I'm just summarizing those 2 columns here to the left. Normally, these columns would be no print, as I'm now showing you the print control field. And let me just show you another example too to hit home this year-to-date activity, because if I wanted to do quarterly columns, like this might be quarter 1 or quarter 2, another common example of a range of periods would be where I hard code in the range. Instead of using the base concept, which is very flexible as your report date changes, what I could do for quarter 1 is period 1 to 3, or for quarter 2, I would be period 4 to 6. And inside this little wizard is a reminder of various choices available within that field. And how about maybe a final example or two, as I like to do general tips and tricks throughout my sessions here. Well, how about I wanted to do period 1, 2, 3 separately? There might be reasons why doing that. And then I could then summarize those through a calculation column. And then finally, those are what we again call hard-coded months. But what if I'm in period 4 and I want to look at the last 3 months? So maybe my concluding examples to this would be I could still use the base concept, like maybe I want to look at 2 months ago, or I want to look at 1 month ago, etc. So we have a lot of flexibility regarding the different time periods you want looked at. The next thing I want to further share is one little gotcha in this strategy I described in these columns D, E, and F is when you have current and retained earnings. Because if you don't close, then your income statement accounts don't get zeroed out. They don't get added to the existing retained earnings. So what I'm going to do in its simplest sense, I'm going to show you an advanced calculation we need for this exercise. And I probably shouldn't say it's advanced. It's not that bad at all. Now, before I get into that calculation formula further, what I want to do is I want to do a sidestep and show you an example of what we call calculation priority. I'm going to pull up a secondary report to discuss that. I'm going to click on this icon to the left of the Generate Report button, which pulls up my last ran report to save me time. And what I'm going to talk about is really, first of all, a calculated row we're going to look at, where I'm calculating margin percent. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about a calculated column. So here's that row I just described, what's called gross margin percent. Now, how about I have two different companies or departments? And in my example, obviously it's the same data, but still the concept will apply. Meaning, how about this is company or department A that has about 50% margin? And then how about here company or department B that also has approximately a 50% margin? So if I'm showing my data side by side, here is a cal row for gross margin. And then secondly, here to the right, I have a calculated column, which sums the columns to the left. And what Manager Porter does first is this row calculation I first introduced. Then secondly, what it's going to do is, as you see to the left, it's going to sum up these two 500 amounts to be 1,000, or it's going to sum up these two amounts yielding this figure. And then additionally, what we see here in this 98% value is the same story, meaning it's summarizing those percents to the left. Well, I wish my company margin was 98%, but here is where we have an intersecting calculated row that intersects with a calculated column. We call that calculation priority. It does, again, the row formula first, and then it did the column calculation second. Now, this is an overstated figure, and to resolve this issue, I'm back in the report, looking at the Settings tab. So here is calculation priority. In the example I just provided, I would want to change that. I'd want to do my column calculation first to summarize my revenue and expenses. And then secondly, I would do the row formula for gross margin percent. And that's going to be used in my balance sheet example and also commonly used for our statement of cash flow report. All right, so let me now close this report out. I'm now going to go back to the balance sheet example I first led in with. All right, looking back at my viewer, and to help in this illustration, what I also did is in the column definition, I added column letters going across the top. I also, here to the right, I added the row code numbers as an easy reference. Because whenever we run a report like I'm broadcasting, we have intersecting row code numbers that intersect with column letters. So for an example, this cell I'm currently pointing to, that is column B for the row 160 we see to the right. Or this cell right here is column B for row 190. Or this cell here randomly is column E for the row 220 that we see here to the right. Let me go back to the column I was just describing. I put in column letters here just for a tutorial. What I also did is we have a column type called the row, which shows the row number next to each. And let me now go inside the row definition for this report, as I did close it out, and I'll pull it back up here. All right, so as I open up the row, and then in my simplified example, I've added some rows here at the very bottom. So here is the case point I'm now describing. Now, first of all, these rows I'm going to highlight here are my normal balance sheet rows where retained earnings. Over here to the right, that's one of my equity accounts in the balance sheet, account 3030. And for a balance sheet, to grab current year-to-date earnings, I'm simply grabbing all revenue expenses, which is for our demonstration company, accounts 4,000, which is my first revenue account, through 8,999. all the way through expenses. So on one single row, I'm grabbing that entire range for my balance sheet for net income. Now, this also strategy I'm talking about is also used for check rows in a report to ensure our data integrity, which I'll have a few remarks later today on. Now, if I don't close, like I earlier noted, then my earnings don't flow to the retained earnings. That only occurs when I do a full formal general ledger close, which many times I do not do because maybe I still want to do audit or adjusting entries in the prior year. That's why we don't close. Now, finally, most formulas inside the system do not require a specific cell calculation. But here's an example of such. If you refer to a single cell or column in my example, I'm going to refer to column F. And notice it says I'm going to add what's in column D for the row 1270, which is retained earnings, and column D is really the prior year, plus column E, which is the current year, row 1300, current year earnings. And if I go back to the report, I'll requote what I just did through the formula. Now, it's really this cell I'm pointing to. That's my prior year retained earnings. Or this cell of 274 grand, that is the activity this year for income. And long story short, I just want to maybe summarize these two values here. Once again, this is cell D1270 and cell E1300. And then in this cell I'm pointing to, that formula read, hey, column F for this row, column F equals those two cells I just commented about. So you have a lot of flexibility on how you can bring in data in your report and maybe move it around. And there's my simplified example to such. And then additionally, let me also come back here and plug the training and user guides, because there's some great little reports here like balance sheet and cash flow, and they have a lot of pages and screen captures of what I just described. So if you again need any of those training documentations, and if anybody that joined the recording or webinar live a little bit later for my introduction, there's my email just to jot down. All right, great. There's my first key concept. If you do not close your year, of the most common question we've got from hundreds of customers over the years. Now, let me take a moment, because another consideration is to make sure all of your reports are clean. And it might be maybe 3 bullet points I'm thinking about. One is to make sure my report's foot, where I'm not missing or duplicating accounts. Or secondly, some cleanup might be, hey, all the reports in my report library, I want to get rid of a bunch of old junk, because if I generate a report 10 times during a day, it's going to store every 10 of those versions, which was bad, designed by Microsoft way back when. And then when I mentioned the new release Prospero, we've made great improvements and tons of new features that I'll maybe send a little email after today's session to further acquaint you with those here. And maybe third and finally, it might be some report cleanup of rows, columns, and trees. So let me circle back to those 3 bullet points. First of all, as I close out this balance sheet report, I'm going to use the same type of strategy. That is, I want to grab all my revenue expenses as a check row in my income statement rows. This is probably one of the oldest tips and tricks in the book, but it's worth maybe a 2 or 3 minute discussion on such tips and tricks session today. And I have a purpose-built report that I'm going to open up here to illustrate great functionality to help you find any missing and duplicate accounts. I'm going to open up the row definition to start. Now here is a detailed income statement, and Manager Porter needed to do that, meaning here is basically 1 line per account. But I see a couple of people on the phone call are already have purchased and migrated to Prospero, but they might be in a transitionary phase. So they're still doing some reports in Manager Porter. Long story short, Manager Porter needed this ugly individual accounts, but in Prospero, we can use a single summary account. Like total revenue might be all accounts that begin with a 4. And then we can automatically expand that. That way we avoid and reduce maintenance usually altogether as new general ledger accounts get added. But in your Microsoft Manager Porter era, here's where I'm calculating sales of all those individual accounts or cost of goods sold. And then the punchline here is I am now formulating net income from all the details above, but it's very common for human error oversight of missing and duplicates. So first and foremost, we always recommend a check row that we add to every single report. We usually will make that no print. And then additionally, I'm just going to have an add a balance formula that takes my net income formula from above, minusing our check row. Usually this add a balance row here at the very bottom hopefully should be 0, which means I'm in balance, and that line normally would not show because I like to suppress rows that have no data based on what department or company that I pull up to avoid clutter. Now, let me give you an oddball example here. What I'm going to do is, let me get rid of these check accounts to begin with. I'm just going to put a bogus account in here temporarily because let's role play that when I ran this report this last month, I see a figure here where I'm out of balance. So one of my first steps is I change the account here, which I just undid. If I find out I'm out of balance, usually what I do is I get rid of all these accounts and I put in some dummy bogus account that I know does not exist in my general ledger, and I'll just save that. And there's two great functionalities in Manager Porter, and there are two different spots in Prospero 1. But if I come here under Tools, let's look at what's called missing account analysis. And for my example, I'm going to randomly pick on this line here and these two accounts, 7404 and 5. How about I'm going to miss account 7405 and I'm going to maybe duplicate an account. Now, the first thing of two for missing accounts, I'm in the row definition. We come here under Tools, Missing Account Analysis. Now, what the system's doing is it's combing through all the different rows in the system, even though here in the background, I'm really just focusing on one single row called IS Detail, Missing and Duplicate Accounts. But here might be row number 1, like my balance sheet from earlier. Or here might be row number 2, my account form. But I'm going to scroll down on this top half of the window, and then here is my row I'm now currently picking on. It told me, hey, Derek, here are all the accounts when I Manager Porter, when it looked to the general ledger of the accounts in the system. Here's it's comparing what's in the row here in the background versus the accounts I have in the general ledger, and it gives me a nice little list of those missing. And then usually what I do is I just highlight all these rows at the very bottom. I open up Excel, and then I can just paste those inside the row definition because maybe 20 of these accounts I know or think are old, but if any are not, then I can see which has a balance, and then I'll include it inside the row. And let me just show you that little step I just described. There in the background, I just highlighted all those rows at the very bottom. I used a shortcut of Control A to select all, and then I did a Control C to copy those because you cannot right-click within that pop-up window, but you can do your shortcut, like Control A, copy all, or Control C, paste. And then here is I'm just going to paste those inside the application. Now here's all the missing accounts. And then here is, okay, I think all of these again are old, but I'm just going to come back to my row definition, and I will just paste those here at the very bottom. And over here in my general ledger link, simply paste. And it's not required here to the left, but usually I just put those temporarily as my description because if any of these had a balance, maybe I'll up above add it to my row. These are all manual, tedious reconciliations whenever you add accounts, but again, Prospero greatly improved upon that. Now, the second thing, after missing accounts, which was in the row definition found here, is the ability to find duplicate accounts, but it's in a different spot. I have to go to the report definition. Like here's where you define your row and column. But then here is on the Output tab, a little check mark to report on duplicate accounts. Now, when I ran the report, which I'll just open up this version here using a shortcut. Now, these duplicate accounts are only seen in the client viewer. They're not seen in the web viewer. Another reason why I prefer the client viewer and not the web viewer. And then once this renders, If I go here under View, Duplicate Accounts, and when I open this up, it might have multiple rows here of multiple accounts, but in my example, I ran this earlier of a different account, but it says, hey, account 5150, because in our chart of accounts, the first 3-digit 100 is our department, the middle 3-digit is our account, and then the last 2 is our project, and it says, hey, account 5150 was duplicated in these different rows, like 2480 and 2540. And if I go full circle back to the row definition, I even can do a find within the tool. So here is in the row definition. If I did edit find or control F, I can find such account here. Okay. All right. So thank you for letting me share that oldest tips and tricks of check rows in our report, missing and duplicate accounts. Now, going back to my earlier 3 bullet points, let's now talk a little bit further about year-end cleanup within our report library. This is done in the client viewer. Here is maybe a report I just ran. I'll even just click on the close button or go back here. And then focusing your eyes here in the lower left, what's called the report library. Now, even though this looks like File Explorer, like on your network or you save Excel and Word files, this is not. This is actually the report library, folders you can create, which behind the scenes stored in one SQL database, all these reports. Now, a couple high-level things is, or are, I can right-click to create a new folder. Any strategy might go because they might be date-driven, like here's a year and months, or they might be group-driven because here is maybe my board of directors reports, or maybe here's my CFO reports, or finally they could be report-driven, like here's my balance sheets or income statements, so almost anything goes. Second quick little thought and sidestep is what we call security. Well, as I'm thinking about security in Manager Porter, that's greatly improved in Prospero, I call Manager Porter security bad and decentralized, to not beat around the bush, because decentralized means, and there's really 2 security mechanisms within Manager Porter. We have security at the folder level and secondly, tree level. Let me demonstrate the first, what we call folder security. If I right-click any folder, like the CFO folder, if I right-click for the library permissions, I get a pop-up window where I identify who can see reports that I output inside this folder. If I click on the Add button, these are users and or groups in the system. Here might be user 1, Nick, user 2, Rob, or better yet, we always recommend using groups because if people come and go, obviously it's more efficient to do that. And we have separate sessions and webinars that we deal with security much further, so I'm not going to go into those details for right now. But let me just go ahead and add an individual group or user. I can click the Add button again just to do a second example of both an individual user and a group up above. And finally, Nick is an administrator in the system, which normally means, yep, I trust Nick, he's in the accounting area, to edit, create, and delete reports over time. But usually people that are not administrators or people in the accounting area, normally they view reports only. They do not edit, create, or delete them to do cleanup maintenance. Now let me do a random example here. Now here's a report that I'm just going to right-click on and show versions. Because if I generate a report 10 times in a month or 100 times in a year, it stores every single version of that. And I can't tell you how many times people have done migration, service packs, and upgrades in Manager Porter or move it from one server to the other. It's ungodly, and sometimes all these old versions prevent me from successfully upgrading. Not an issue with Prospero, thankfully. Now, as I right-click to show versions, here is maybe the not best example, and maybe I'll go back to one where I have multiple versions here. All right, let me go to one of my Derek reports here that I know I've ran numerous times. Okay. For this income statement detail, same story. I'm going to right-click to show versions, and here is all these versions over time. It stores all of those. So I could do one of two things. I could either come up here and delete individual versions, or better yet, sometimes I just come up here and delete the entire report or reports plural through a right click. All right, so definitely that would be some year-end maintenance that some people have never done this ever over multi-year time frame, so worth a little tip there. The next thing I want to maybe conclude with, to not leave one thought in limbo, is we were earlier talking on security, what was called folder security. So notice all these folders, I'd have to secure every individual one. That's why I mentioned it was bad and decentralized. Then secondly, Manager Reporter Security is bad compared to the new version Prospero in that I would have to go to tree security. That's the second way I commonly and more granularly define who can see what data. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to open up a report that utilizes a tree, because how about maybe the 20 people I see in today's phone call? How about one of you is Department A, another person is Department B? So I'm now opening up an income statement report where it utilizes a tree for department. And then here to the right is what we call tree security. I'll do two examples inside this field. One is I'm going to highlight this summary node of all departments because I want to give myself and the CFO that. As I double click, users and groups, that same window we saw before. How about I created an accounting group that I and the CFO belong to? Now here in the lower left, the last little emphasis and check mark I'm going to turn on is, yes, I want the accounting group to be able to see not only the summary unit, but all the child units as well. And once I click OK, and then when any of us in the accounting group open that report, we can see all tree units. Or second example, how about we have someone in the service department? I'm maybe more granularly double clicking that users and groups button here in the top right. And how about Noah is the manager of that area? And final thought, or thoughts plural, is if you apply security, like I demonstrated, make sure to add yourself. Otherwise, you might get an error saying, hey, even though you're administrator, you do not have access to the tree unit. So that's a common error and support question we get all the time. Second thing is, this was just one tree in all the different tree units, but notice here, I have many, many trees, once again, decentralized. So Prospero has that now streamlined and centralized, and maybe look for further information on that. Final thing, as I just recap the 2 bullet points on security, or shall I say cleanup, is report cleanup. Because how about now I've been around the organization for 10 years, I have not really cleaned up my reports. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this yellow folder icon that sometimes people not really aware of. That is where I can see all my reports. As you see, I'm on the report tab, or I can see all my rows, etc. And notice the check mark. That means, yeah, this row is used for report, but these without the check mark probably is an old report I haven't used for a long time. Like you see when it's modified, or even back to the report definition, we even have more fields of who last used it, generated, etc., and whom. Like I did earlier, on a pop-up window like this, I'm not able to right-click to copy and paste, but I can do a Control-A to select all. I'm going to go back to Excel, and then here I'm just going to simply paste it in. Unfortunately, it does not give me headings, but this is my report label or ID, and this is the row, column, or tree being used. And then I can do some easy maintenance of these reports thereafter. Maybe I have a little note saying old, bad, etc. Now, one related thought to that is maybe I have so much junk out there, sometimes it's easier for me to create a new file of these rows, columns, and trees, and then maybe export only the good stuff out to a file, then import it into a new, what we call, building block group. Now, right now, this is a building block group where I have, let's call it 100 reports in there. Let's say only 20 are valid. So I'm going to do one little step backwards. That is in our company area. we have, for this company that I'm currently logged into, and normally all companies I have, if you're a multi-company environment, normally all of my companies, I store all my rows, columns, and trees inside one file or one building block group. So here as I click on the modifier view buttons, let me show you the one field I'm referring to. All right, so here's the building block group. Usually it's called default that your reports are stored into out of the box, like you see this list here, but we really just created another one for maybe different demonstration purposes. All right, but let's say I have 100 reports inside this default building block group that all my companies share, but it's getting ugly and cluttered. So what I'm going to do then is two things. One is I can create a new building block group that's blank, that has nothing in it. So here in the top right, once I click on the new button, I just give it a name. I'll just call it test or whatever. Now this building block group, again, has nothing in it. Since I just created it, it has no row, column, trees, or reports in it. But what I want to do is I want to take reports out of this default building block group that has maybe 100 reports in it. I'm going to export those out. And then once I click on this little check mark here, obviously that's what we don't have it in, but normally your environment has default that I want to emphasize. So here is 2 steps. I'm basically going to export only just the 20 reports I have or like. And now let me even correct that statement, because usually what I would do is, first of all, I would export everything out, all 100 of my reports. Now when I select all, notice I'm on the report tab, but then there's a little sentence here above that says, hey, I'm also going to export the related rows, columns, and trees. So looking at this row tab, those that have a check mark, I'm going to export those out. Same story here in the column. These columns that are used for report automatically gets chosen, but usually I come up here and I just export everything out just as an added precaution in case maybe I want to save and use those down the road. And to cut the corners here, I'm not going to do all the little keystrokes, but long story short, I'm first of all on the report tab, I'm going through all tabs, selecting all, and I'm going to export out. And really when you do export, what it does is it produces a file with a .tdbx extension, and that's really just Microsoft's extension for a temporary database file of manager reporter reports, rows, columns, trees. So I might do this 2 times, one with every report, all 100, but then the second time I might just come up here and maybe I have a folder that I have here, maybe these are all the good reports, and then I'd come up here and export that out to maybe a secondary file called good. And then when I created that new building block group here in the back called test, I would simply just import in that second file that only has maybe my 20 good reports in it. And usually what I like to do is go back to where I was just a moment ago. Under company, I looked at these 2 buttons. First of all, under company area, I inventoried to see what building block group my companies are using, and usually they all share one building block group. It's very rare that they do not. And then here the modifier view button allows me to confirm which building block group is being used. And the second thing was I created a new building block group, because here, to go full circle, I'd come up here and modify, and I'd point it now to use the new test that has only maybe my 20 good reports in it. And I might go to the other couple of companies and have them now use the good test one. All right, thank you for that little note. Let's look at some other audit reports that are very common at year end for account reconciliation, or how about I'm going to have my auditors coming in next week. So what I'm going to generically do is pull up a couple different trial balance files, and really we're going to leverage the account and transaction detail and maybe sending it out to Excel. And what I want to do is just show you a couple little flavors behind that. First of all, I'm going to open up a report a little bit different from the norm to introduce what are called account attributes. Okay, so in this particular report, instead of me running it to waste our time here, I'm going to click on this shortcut to the left, pull up the report last ran. And what you're going to see is a top half where I'm displaying current activity. and then the bottom half year to date. Additionally, I always try to do summarized reports leveraging ranges and wildcards in my row definition. And then additionally, I like to leverage account level and transaction detail in a report. Let me start with a latter little phrase I made. That is in the report definition. Sometimes we'll have some new users on the call here. So inside the detail level, this allows us maybe 3 levels when I look at the financial data. Level 1, financial, level 2, account, and level 3, transaction, and I chose all 3 for this report. Let me go back now to our viewer. This is level 1, the financial level. Now, if you're using a tree, you might have a secondary level because here within expenses or any other random unit, it might then show you the different levels of the tree. Now, if I continue further on one of these tree nodes, like this is Department A corporate or here's Department B sales, now the second level is what we call the account level. Or third and finally, I have also transaction level. Now, for speed, I did not run this for transaction level. However, let me now take a moment and export this out to Excel. And within the client viewer, I get this pop-up window that gives me much more nimble choices when I export versus a web viewer does not provide me these, as another reason why. Another advantage of the client viewer, let me just quickly demonstrate, is if you're ever utilizing a tree, then inside the web viewer now I'm transitioning to, I think the graphics are bad inside the web viewer. One thing is, a lot of times this top third of the page gets wasted, where I might only see about 60 or 70% of a report versus in a client viewer, I'm seeing maybe the 100% of the report or as much that fits on one page. Secondly, I'm not fond of the web viewer because if I'm using a tree, I'm lazy. I'd rather not come here in the lower left to click on the tree. Now notice this tree only has a couple units in it and I do not have the folder structure. And if I had more than 10 units, I'd have to scroll up and down. I'm lazy. I don't like that. I'd rather not. And then if I go back, this is in the web viewer. And if I go back to the client viewer, another reason why I prefer it, because here's the tree already broken out and expanded for me. I see much larger graphics here to the right. And then additionally, I have the report library settlement maintenance we spoke of earlier. That's not in the web viewer. But for my end users and managers, hey, great. The web viewer is perfectly fine. I don't want to bash it too much, but me as a power user, you probably get my recommendation there. Now, as I return back to this Excel export icon here, notice to the right, the detail, like account and transaction, are grayed out because I have to either choose if I'm using a tree, either one of these buttons for the current unit, which would be only one tree unit, but I'm going to export all the reporting units, including maybe financial account and maybe even third transaction. Finally, I usually like to turn on this little check mark to open up Excel once this is all done. And then maybe now I'm doing audit reconciliation in advance of my auditors coming in town next week. Or instead of them bugging me every 5 minutes of the 5 days next week in my year-end audit, I'm just going to give them this one little file and they're going to play around and do with whatever they need afterwards. As I open up this report, now sometimes I like to have data on different sheets. Here is company or department 1. The sheet -F is what we call the financial level, or this -A sheet is the account level. And third, I might even have a sheet -T for transaction level if I ran it. Then here again is Department 300 financial level, Department 300A account level, or I could have a transaction level. These are different sheets. Sometimes that's nice. Otherwise, when I export, let me call out one other button to your attention. There might be times when I'm exporting multiple units out. It could be multi-company I have in the tree. Maybe I want to export it to a single sheet. All right. Now, at times, it's nice to have this data being a little bit segregated in different sheets or tabs. However, let me also show you a second flavor to this report. But before I do so, let me emphasize how this first report was designed. It's nothing too complex or different. It's basically here in my original report that I'm going to go back to and let in with. I have basically the account segment or dimension only in my row definition, where we're using ranges and wildcards. Here at the top, I'm looking at current period activity, but in the lower rows, I'm looking at year-to-date balances. So as I return to the row definition, one of the key concepts is for year-to-date, I'm simply using what's called an account modifier. And there's really two types of modifiers Manager Reporter has. One is time-oriented, like this account modifier, I call it time because maybe I want beginning balances, maybe I want current balances year-to-date. Normally that I'm doing in the column definition, but we have ability to do so in our rows. Then the second type of filter is what's called a book code, because usually I have a column, like the column to the left would be actual, the column to the right being budget. I'm obviously not showing it, but I'm describing it. However, there might be instances, instead of showing actual and budget side by side in my column, that I might want to show it in my rows, actual and budget. An example would be, hey, maybe I'm going to have 12 months of actual only in the column, 12 months of actual, but maybe I want to have a budget row for net income. That way I don't have 24 or 36 columns of 12-month actual, 12-month budget, and 12 months of variance. Maybe sometimes I do that in a row on a trended report. Budgets, that my column has actuals, just to emphasize I was clear on that. All right, so there's a couple other tips of these account modifiers and attributes. Ranges and wildcards, we're looking at a few different flavors. That's sort of commonplace, but we have separate little webinar sessions that go into that a little bit further. Now, yeah, there's an advantageous reasons why I designed my report on that, but then let me show you here. I have a full account detail report I also want to show you because maybe I want the rows already pre-expanded without all the separate tabs or details. So here's a report now I'd like to broadcast for maybe my year-end reconciliations. Long story short, in the row definition, instead of having my account only segment or dimension, I have multiple segments brought into the row. So already on this very first level, this is my first financial level. I did not drill into the account or transaction level. I'm seeing every account combination. Now let me do a sidestep and back in Designer. I'm going to do a couple row definition built from scratch. I'm in a new row. I'm going to come here under Edit, Insert Rows from Dimensions, which really is, maybe my intent is I want to create a trial balance or income statement detail. Now here as it recognizes the segments in my general ledger. In our demonstration database, we generically name those, but this is really the department, this is our account, and this is our project. Well, by default, Manager Reporter will want to build your row and most reports on your main account segment, your natural, like revenue expense balance sheet, where you see the ampersands or hooks in that segment. These ampersands or hooks means, yes, go build and grab this segment from the general ledger, versus the pound sign are in my non-natural account segments, which means do not build the row on these segments. And how about if I wanted to bring in revenue expenses for my income statement? I'm going to type in the following range. And then once I click on OK, here are my revenues that have a little credit balance here of the C here. And then for an income statement, I would probably just add a few rows and headings for total revenue, total expense. And that's how usually we create a new report from scratch. This example was only on the account segment. Let me undo that. I went under Edit Undo, or I just did a shortcut there to the right of Control Z. And now the second thing I'm going to do is repeat my step, but this time I'm going to build the row on multiple segments. So I'm going to come here, ampersand or hook to grab all those. Over here, grab all these. So every combination I have, once I click OK. Now this is just at this one point in time, meaning right now, let's say I have 1,000 combinations, but maybe next year I post different combinations, maybe I have 1,200, or the following year 1,400 combinations. So I like to emphasize this is just at this point in time the valid combination. So maybe once a year I just build my row from scratch like I'm demonstrating now, but that is the row technique used to create this last version of the report. That way, again, it might help you or others to maybe see it already quote unquote pre-expanded, that account level detail. All right, perfect. Looking at my little notes here, I'm now going to talk about another key concept I like to provide as a tip. That is, let me open up a income statement summary row definition. And how about this is really leading up to what is called dimension value sets. And let me now find one of the rows I'm going to use here on that. Okay, now in this income statement, I might have a row like this example that maybe my chart of accounts is not cleanly numbered as much as I'd like it to be since I'm an anal accountant. Now here is one of my sales rows. I have a bunch of different accounts in this line, and how about my crazy controller just added a new account for 4605 today. That's part of this group. Well, I might be in one row, but I might have 10 reports that utilize this. Well, that means is I'm going to hopefully remember here in the background, I might have to go to a second, third, or fourth report to make the same edit. Well, what I can do is I can basically click on this little button here to manage dimension value sets. Now, these dimension value sets, let me just show you through another window that's a little bit more centralized. Now, within any row, column, or tree, this is not seen in the report, but any row, column, or tree, if you go under Edit, Manage Dimension Value Sets. And I'm going to do two examples. First of all, I'm going to continue with the account segment, which is more common. Then secondly, I'm going to talk about the department. Now, the first thing is here in this little pick list in our demonstration database to repeat, segment 2 is our main or natural account, which has our balance sheet and income statement accounts in it. Below, you see some current dimension value sets, like here's receivable and the accounts, or here's cash and the accounts. And if I come up here and click on the new button, I can just give it any name. I'll just call it test. How about maybe this is my same sales? It's the 41 accounts. This is oddball accounts, that 4005 through 4509, yada, yada, yada. And then finally, maybe it's the 46 accounts, but it's not the accounts 46, 11, and 12. All right. So here is where now I'm centrally defining this. I want to emphasize this area is not related to this one row I'm in. This is central in the system, which means, hey, I can come up here and I'm going to go full circle. I'm just going to use one that already exists here. So here's my cost of goods sold. I'm going to even open up a random new row to further emphasize how it's sort of centrally defined. And I'm going to come up here in my natural account for segment 2. Yeah, I have my little pick list here of all my numerical accounts that I normally see in my general ledger. However, instead of me clicking on this little button here or doing a range or wildcard, I'm going to click on this button, Dimension Value Set. And then here's that one I'll just pick on called Cost of Goods Sold. Like you see the test one. And then there's the accounts, which I click OK. And lo and behold, there it is. Otherwise, if I had some other account, like account 4000, you might see just the segment 2 without the word set in front of its name. That means a dimension value set. That was one of my first examples of 2. I'm going to return back and do a second example found under Edit, Manage Dimension Value Sets. Well, before I do my second example in department, for those people I see in the fall call, there's a couple that are moving to Prospero here early next year, is These dimension value sets, there's no logic, rhyme, or reason to them. Meaning I can miss stuff, I can duplicate stuff, and they're not cohesively defined, because in Prospero, we have a very great concept, what is called an account roll-up tree, which you can have different nodes, like here's my node of the tree called net income. Beneath, I might have a node called revenue expense. So it's all centrally defined in one tree where I have hierarchy and relationships, where I have no relationships or data integrity on these dimension value sets. But we now have added that in Prospero. The second example outside of segment 2, which is remain or natural, is I'm going to go to segment 1, which is our department, because here might be my administrative departments. The new button or modify here in the top right to either create a new one or edit an existing one. And then here I'll just close that window I demonstrated in the last case, but there is maybe my marketing departments. Here's my manufacturing. And then let me go full circle with this manufacturing department or admin. I earlier exampled in a row definition referring to those, but let me now go to the column, because here might be my admin or manufacturing. Maybe I want to do a side-by-side report. And we have here, whenever you have a financial dimension column where you're grabbing data from the general ledger, we have the same type of dimension filter window. Segment 1 is our department. Instead of me looking up the individual ones in the general ledger, I'm going to use that same button here, dimension value set. How about there's my admin, or then to the right, I'll grab manufacturing. And then if I change my mind, maybe my crazy controller, instead of adding new accounts, they added some crazy new departments and locations. If I'm ever expanding, that's an easy way to accomplish that using dimension value sets. All right, and the last little thing I like to do is, again, I'm in any random row, column, or tree, as I like to repeat one key concept. I'm just going to come up here under Edit, Manage Dimension Value Sets. All right, let's see. I'm looking back to my notes here. Let's, now that we have about 10 minutes remaining in this phone call, I want to see if we have any questions that came through the queue. Looks like no questions currently. A lot of people at times are a little shy or just being a sponge to absorb that data. So probably in the next few minutes, I'm going to wind down. But again, maybe those that joined a little bit late here live, there's my contact information. So if I can be an information source for you down the road, I, amongst our large team of staff members, can assist you with any questions you have down the road. Additionally, one other little takeaway is I referenced these training and user guides for Managed Reporter. Very long and beefy, hundreds of pages, step-by-step, tons of screen captures, a lot of what I demonstrated the recording today. If you do not have that, send me an email. I'll be sure to get those into your hands. Otherwise, how about I'll just start winding down for today's session. I'll say a big thank you for joining us today. You probably found us in these webinars out on our website at msxgroup.com. So we have a nice upcoming little webinar schedule that you see here in our events. Otherwise, please look for a follow-up email for those people that did either register or attend live. We'll be doing a little follow-up thank you email, and I'll be sharing some of the recording links, training guides, etc. So otherwise, have a great day and happy holidays ahead. Take care.